Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Deconstructors Club podcast. And it's our really last of the year. I'm your host, Alex Weiss, with Bob Azarito, your co-host. And we're doing it on Christmas because this is going to come out on Christmas Eve. And then we'll take a little break and we'll talk about maybe if we do maybe a couple of other episodes, we'll talk about that too. We're trying to navigate what the new year is going to look like because we're trying to just close up this season in our podcast and then, take maybe about a month break or so and then come back again, near springtime and kick off a new season. And we actually, there's some ideas, but I don't know if we should talk about those ideas right now, but you know what? We could probably sow some seeds. And what I mean by that is, who knows, maybe we can have some type of in-person gathering for those that are actually near us that would be interested.
That'd be fun.
And we just come together. It doesn't even matter how many people. I mean, if you're listening to it, because we have listeners not only across the country, we have listeners around the world that are listening to us, which has been very interesting where we've seen people that have downloaded our episodes and so forth. But I know we do have people locally, not just in the Sacramento area, maybe in Northern California that would like to come out, take a day. We'd put those dates down, maybe sometime coming up here in the spring that we can get together.
That'd be fun.
And through these episodes, we can, begin to promote it. So that way everybody has the date down, the place down that they would like to just, take a moment to set this, schedule it and head on up here and be with us. It would be great.
Be great.
Yeah. Who knows? We might have it at a brewery. I don't know.
Yeah.
And if, people don't want it at a brewery or have it at a coffee shop, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
I like beer, so I prefer brewery.
You like coffee too. I've seen you.
But I like coffee too. That's right. I like both. True that. That is very true. So, Bob, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Like you said, Christmas Eve, this is going to come out. So, a little bit of a crunch time as you head towards Christmas because, the holidays and family and traditions that we have. But I'm really excited for this topic because I think sometimes when you begin to talk this way, you may give the impression to some people that the story is not important. Mm-hmm. And nothing could be further from the truth. It's just, why is it important? Or what about the story is important? And that's the stuff we're trying to get at. And Christmas can be difficult because, like we said last time, sometimes it's just relegated to children's pageants or just, what the children are talking about, like getting the gifts and the presents and this sort of thing. And then the story is just sort of background. But we miss out on so much power of these stories when you begin to look at it and think about it from a different perspective. Right. So,
and we were talking about that the last episode because we're dedicating these 2 episodes for Christmas.
Yeah,
and we talked about what the academic scholars, the academic biblical scholars, are talking about, in particular. The discussions around, and what the consensus says, of course, the discussions around, did this actually happen or not? Mm-hmm. And the primitive church weren't so hung up on, the actual historical facts. Did it come out the exact same way that, they're saying it? In those days, and the cultural context reflects that, storytelling was a big, big thing, even if it was fantastical. Mm-hmm. But people understood the fantastical ways of the story were ways to create an emphasis of the point that they wanted to drive home, the point that they wanted to, communicate. And that was one of the things. There was a narrative within the primitive church. So when the Gospels were written, and they were written because they were influenced by already a narrative that the church had. It wasn't the story that influenced the narrative, because the Gospels were written years after, the death and the claimed death and resurrection of Christ, right? Years after that. So you're almost looking at the last part of the first century when all of these Gospels were written. And when they were written, there was already a lot of storytelling going on from the stories of the apostles and the claims that, the apostles talked about. This is how Jesus, walked the earth and so forth. So these are the kind of things that we in our modern times can't really understand fully or grasp fully, because we're so based on, we need facts, we need exact, we need, it has to be historically accurate, it has to be. And for the primitive church, it wasn't even about historical accuracy. It was more the reason why that story was there.
And it wasn't just the church, it was really the times. I mean, this is the way things were communicated. Go back to the Greek stories that were told, Hercules and all the different stories that were told to communicate certain things about the culture or about, whatever it was that they were trying to communicate. All of these, what we now call as myths.
Right.
And, but these stories were told as a way to communicate truth.
Right.
And, go read Joseph Campbell about the Greek myths and the way these stories were used. And then in that same period of time, that same bracketed time in history, you have these stories of the Gospels that also, and of the Bible that were also
and in
written.
essence, we're not saying that Jesus is mythical. That's not what we're saying.
No.
But we're saying that because the context of that time, that culture, the way they story told, it wasn't like, okay, we're going to counteract that with our own historical accurate.
Right.
They're more like, no, we're going to describe a story that fits the narrative of the primitive church, of who we are.
So here's a good question. So you have a story. Would you rather hear the story and knew it was historically accurate, or would you rather hear the story and understand its meaning? Because I always felt that the important thing about these stories was for me to accept and to acknowledge that it happened.
Well, the fact that the story is there, again, there's something that the primitive church is communicating to us, that this has been our narrative. And if we really, really want to apply stuff from then to now, which we tend to do the opposite, apply the now to then. We always approach the scripture with our own narratives, how we've been influenced in our modern world. So when we bring our modern eyes to the text, we're imposing upon the text our own perspectives. So when you take a step back and look at it academically, and we're especially coming from people that have studied this for so long, talking about historical, context and so forth and cultures, you begin to understand that the way they wanted you to see this wasn't historically accurate or theologically accurate. They weren't thinking of any of those things. What they were telling you was a story that this is who we are, and this is what we want to communicate to you. This is who Jesus is. This is what the church believes in the sense how we practice and what we do. So the question here is, like you're saying, is it important for us to see the scripture in such accuracy, or is it more important for us to understand the reason why that story's there?
Right. So for some reason, the Western mind put a much greater weight on acknowledging that something happened, even more weight on acknowledging that it happened than what it means that it happened.
Exactly. That's how our modern way thinks,
right.
Our modern brain mind.
So when with this Christmas story, the facts that we were given about the story, it was important that I acknowledged those facts and accepted them as having happened just the way the Bible said it happened.
Right.
That was the extent of believing in the Christmas story. You believe in the Christmas story if you believe that it happened just the way it says it happened. Right. But what if you don't pay any attention to why the story was told and what was meant by the story?
Right.
Doesn't that mean that you don't believe in the story?
Right.
Isn't it better to think that the meaning of the story is what determines whether or not you believe in the story rather than its historical accuracy?
Right.
I mean, so much of what we read in the scriptures, you can't really prove one way or another that it actually happened in exactly that way.
Right.
So why do we spend so much time writing evidence that demands a verdict, and then more evidence that evidently demands a verdict, and then more evidence that demands? Why do we keep writing as if the only real important thing is that it happened this way, rather than talk about why was this story even preserved and communicated to us now?
Now, what you're saying for me is significant. If we have a story that's been preserved, that's how important the story is.
Absolutely.
And for me, I'm not in any way discrediting the scripture or thinking about it any less just because I don't believe, it's like historically accurate or scientifically accurate, which basically there's so much proof that it's not. But that's not the point.
It's not the point.
That's not what the church was trying to communicate.
Because those who are dedicated to proving that it did not happen are as unhelpful as those who spend all their time proving that it did happen. Yeah, they might write a book called Evidence That Proves It Didn't Happen, and then more evidence that proves it didn't happen. Both of them are concentrating on a Western mentality issue, but not on the ancient mind issue, which is why was this story preserved for us?
That is the key.
It is.
And for me, that's the key to Christmas. The Christmas story, I don't need it to be historically accurate. I don't need it to be scientifically accurate. I don't need it to be literally accurate. I just want to accept the reason why the story's there. There's something it's communicating to me, and it's been preserved for that. So that way it could impact me in a positive way, in a faith way.
Yeah, it's almost unfortunate that we have to actually talk about this thing that we're talking about, which is, what does it mean that it's historically accurate? Or what does it mean if it's not historically accurate? It's almost too bad, because in a way, neither of those options are why the story was written down and why the story was passed on. So it's just because of our Western mentality that elevates facts or what actually happened above what the story is about, or what stories are about.
And what exactly.
So there's a reason that this was passed on, and we don't have to spend any time really, if we don't want to. What's the evidence that it did happen? What's the evidence that it didn't happen? We don't really have to, especially if we never get to why is this important. And that's the amazing thing about the Christmas stories. They say some amazing things about life and birth and the world and meaning and love and compassion and togetherness, all the things that the narrative was trying to get us to see.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about that narrative. Okay. Like Christ coming and being born, we talked about that last time, in such humble circumstances, and even to the point of humiliating circumstances, because, stable animals. I mean, this wasn't a pretty sight, what was happening here. But the church wanted to communicate that specific story to us so that we could understand this is king for us. This is Lord for us. It's subverted completely. It's not, see, the Roman Empire is exalting their Caesar and the gods and raising them to deity, and the way with its pomp, splendor, power, and glory, and riches, and all that. Our king, our Kyrios, Lord, is the one that came and was born in a humble setting. And I don't like to use the word humble, because it was just beyond humble. It was humiliating.
And just what you're saying is the reason in that day why the three kings, or the three counselors to the kings, what we've called the wise men.
The wise men.
And there's three of them, by the way.
I know. The tradition gives them three in their names, but it could have been, there was some that even believe there was hundreds
of with them. No question there was, because they were actually counselors to the kings.
Full-blown entourage,
Yeah. So they come, and where do they go? They don't go to Bethlehem.
No.
They go to the king's
palace.
Because when they're there, they say they've come to worship he who is born King of the Jews.
Right.
When they come to say that, of course they were going to go to the palace. Because it's obviously that person would be born into royalty. That person would be born as part of the present king's family. So they, of course, go there. And of course they're wrong, and they find out that they're wrong, and so but that shows us what the expectation was for a king born in that day. It was the special people, the privileged people, those that have wealth and power, and they were the ones that were viewed as important. Viewed as authoritative. And so this idea of this humble birth that becomes this person that we now follow, it just shatters all of those expectations.
And who continues to stay within that margin, continues to stay within poverty, continues to stay within the oppressed, continues to stay within disenfranchised and rejected. There's a narrative that is influencing the story.
Totally. And you know that the driving story that was used in the church at baptism was the birth narratives of Jesus. Because when you baptize a child in the church, you are reflecting the same message as what we receive in the birth narratives of Jesus. That just as the angels sang at the birth of Jesus, so the angels sing at the baptism and at the birth of all children, no matter how humble. Just as the shepherds brought this grand announcement of this birth, so shepherds run to bring the announcement of your birth. It was the way.
And again, who's the herald in the picture here? It's not this assigned by the king with the official stamp of heralding, this is the Messiah. It's the humblest of humblest.
Absolutely.
The shepherds that are out of the field.
And the message of Christmas, there is nobody who is born without that kind of honor. Every birth is honored. Every birth is heralded. Every birth is special and amazing. And it's the story through which we can see our own births as well as the birth of all people, no matter how humble or how poor.
That what you just said is the key. That birth. See, and we continue to talk about the death, which is very important, but that birth gives you the understanding of the gospel. If he came in under these circumstances, he did it, like how it says the Bible, to identify with us, meaning to include all of us.
Absolutely.
And the inclusion is so emphasized that instead of instead of them staying at the palace, finding the Messiah, the child king, they had to go all the way out of their way to where he was at. And in humble surround, there was no pomp and circumstance around any of the places that he was at. I mean, many believe it wasn't Bethlehem; it was in Nazareth where they actually came back and found him. You know, because that's like 2 years later, and or was it it was Bethlehem, right? I'm sorry, I'm a little confused here. It was 2 years, but when they came around and they found him, the Bible doesn't give us a description, but I'm pretty sure they were shocked. And surprised because they had never seen anything like that before.
Never.
They're advisors to the kings. They only know palaces. They only know power. They only know riches. And now they're driving up. Maybe it's chariots and camels but they're driving up to this house in the hood. No,
riding up. Yeah,
they're riding up. I was like, they're driving up. And they're riding up to this house in the hood where it's like, what in the world? Why are we here? But that is the key. Again, I revert back to saying That is the narrative of the church that they want to communicate to us. This is an all-inclusive Savior. This is an all-inclusive Messiah. This even runs against our modern thinking of Christianity that is exclusive, not inclusive.
Yeah. It shouldn't escape anyone's notice that these counselors to the kings, these wise men, they were of a different religion.
Yeah.
They weren't Jews.
No.
They weren't. They were
pagan religions.
Probably Zoroastrian was probably closer to the religion, and yet they came and worshipped this. They were told they were led to come and worship at this. That's the story. Right. Now, if you really want to drive yourself crazy, try to make all the timelines fit for all of these things. Right. Don't waste your time.
Right.
They don't really fit. It doesn't matter.
Right.
That's not the point.
That's the point.
The point is the story is trying to tell us something. Right. That Jesus didn't come to start a new religion.
Right.
Jesus didn't come to support the supremacy of Judaism.
Right.
Jesus did not come to somehow make the one religion that everybody had now come and serve. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus came to tell us what it means to be a human being. And that's what the story helps, all the other stories as well. But this story at the very beginning, at the beginning of the life of Jesus, is trying to tell us something about what it means to be a human being.
And to reveal to us the image of God in everyone.
Absolutely. So
which evens out the playing field completely.
Presence and image of God in all people. And John 1 is the one who John interprets the birth stories in John 1 that the word inhabits, the God inhabits, the presence of God, the Spirit of God inhabits every single human coming into the world. That is John's understanding of the birth. That it was a celebration of the reality that this divine presence attends every birth, not just the birth of Jesus, but that's where we see it.
Right.
And now theology applies it to every single human, not just a certain special ones.
It's great. And it's interesting because the story continues. I know we don't have a lot of time in this episode. We're going to try to cut it short, but because we don't want to take too long of the time away from people enjoying their Christmas time.
No, I'm having fun now, so keep going.
Well, from there, the story takes an interesting turn because, we see that in Matthew. Herod, tries to figure out, inquires through the wise men where, the child is. So because of that, Herod goes, kills off every child in the area 2 years and younger. So Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus have to flee. When they run, they end up going as refugees into Egypt. It's such an interesting narrative because the church really, really wanted you to know it. They're almost saying, we don't want to skip over this part of the story. We could just skip over it and just kind of jump ahead to the future, but we don't want to skip over it because it's significant. Why is it significant? Because in their time, they had to suffer they suffered a lot of persecution, a lot of displacement. The church had to be displaced. I mean, first of all, the first persecution that happened in Judea, where they were spread out all over. It's a diaspora that ended up happening within the Christians, and then that's when the center of the church wasn't Jerusalem anymore. It ended up becoming Antioch and Ephesus, and so it kind of jumped around because people were being displaced by persecution, by being pushed out. So in many ways, they had to go through this own personal narrative of being a refugee, of being relocated, of how uncomfortable that is in different cultures. And so when these stories came about, they're like, we cannot skip over this part because here's our example.
Very good.
Of a refugee that we experienced and we followed in his footsteps.
Right. And maybe it had something to do with just exactly what you're saying. They were all, experiencing refugee status, right?
A lot of times
as the story developed, that's where the story went, to show that Jesus was also like us,
Right.
a refugee,
Right.
and had to flee into another country for safety, and how it alters our view, could alter our view of what it means to be a refugee. Isn't that interesting? Because
many of us here in America don't understand that.
no,
We've never like truly been displaced from our own nation out of very difficult
and
circumstances.
yet the history of the world depends upon the migration of the movement of populations. In fact, this country, America, is really dependent upon the movement of displaced people in many cases, looking for a better future, a better life, or safety from tyrants and safety from violence. And yet now in our world, or our mentality today, so many people have such a negative view toward refugee status.
It's such a nationalistic view
and
such a supremacy.
Such a superiority view, as if, how dare refugees come? I'll bet you can't go 2-3 generations back, and every single person that came out of a refugee.
And Jesus said in Matthew 25, the way you treated them is you treated me. We have no idea that a lot of the refugees that are coming here, asylum seekers that are seeking shelter, they're Jesus.
That's what the story can teach us if we're willing to see it.
They represent the narrative.
And
of him being the refugee coming into Egypt.
And see how unhelpful it is to spend all of our time saying, well, I don't know, did Jesus really go to Egypt, or did he not go to Egypt? Or wouldn't he have been 2 years old and not an infant at the time?
Right. Did it fit? The narrative didn't fit, or the history, the historical.
And spend all of our time thinking that, well, if I teach that he really went, then I've taught the Bible. I want to say you have not yet taught the Bible if you end with the fact that Jesus was taken to Egypt and then released and came back up and settled in Nazareth, or whatever, however you describe it after that. But the idea is that if you don't ask the question, why is this important? You miss the point of the story even being told.
And I think our point here, to kind of sum everything up here, as our part 2, we've been explaining that so much emphasis in our modern way of thinking and our Western way of thinking, and we should add that, and well, you've been saying that already, but our Western way of thinking has always been, let's see the accuracy of this first, instead of saying, let's understand the purpose why we have it still, why it's here. And I think the summary of our purpose, of what we believe the church was trying to communicate, was the subvertedness of Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior. This is our leader. This is our Savior. This is who we follow. And it's not at all, not even come close to what this world follows and this world esteems and exalts, which is power, which is riches, which is money, superiority, so forth, racism in our context.
And for that reason, you don't even, if that's what you're trying to preserve, you do not want to ask, why did they tell this story? That's why you don't want to. If you want to preserve all those things that you just mentioned, if you ask those questions, it just runs right smack contrary.
And many times you're missing the purpose why it was there. You're missing why it was written, why we still have that story from a narrative that's being communicated.
And can we say this to our deconstructing friends? Those of you out there who felt like you were no longer welcome in the church because you didn't necessarily believe certain aspects of the story were historically accurate. And you were made to feel that because you felt that way, you no longer belonged. Let me just be clear. Let us just sort of be clear that somebody pulled a fast one over on you, because that has nothing to do with whether or not you believe in the story.
Right.
The fact that you may not think all of that's historically accurate in exactly the way it was told, or maybe you even think that somebody actually made up parts of the story, whatever you think about it.
Which some scholars do believe that was an added part of the story.
That doesn't say that you don't believe in the story.
Right.
And
it doesn't discredit the story, because it's still the primitive church adding to the story
the most
important aspects.
And the most important part of the story is what it means.
Right.
And if you believe that refugees are valuable, if you believe that they're worth respect, that they deserve respect and dignity and welcome, if you believe that, then you believe in that part of the story of Jesus.
That's right.
And whether or not, whatever you believe factually, there's so much in there, whether you believe that something happened factually or not, that has nothing to do with whether you believe in the story. Because when you say you believe in the story, it means that you believe in what that story means and why it's important.
See, and a lot of people, they revert back to their identity politics. But that was a different setting back in the day. They're trying to rationalize and explain away Jesus as a refugee compared to the asylum seekers or the refugees that are coming in. A refugee is a refugee.
Yeah, and
Jesus was one. The church, primitive church, they experienced that. That's what they wanted you to know, that a refugee is a refugee. Modern times, a refugee is a refugee.
Sure, and it doesn't take away the complications of being a welcoming community.
And we always put conditions because of our hyper individualized way of being. We, in our nation, we put conditions, just the way we put conditions on salvation. You need to do a prayer, you need to do this, you need to do that, and then you're in. In the same manner, okay, the refugees, but are they doing it the legal way? This is just such a complicated system.
Sure.
To try to understand, and the desperation that these people are feeling. They don't got time to be submitting a 10-year deal in their nations, and they don't have time for all of these things. There's a desperation to survive and to have a better future. And so if we were in their shoes, what would we do?
Yeah.
We'd be doing the same thing.
Right. And if we're not trying to think of ways to welcome as many refugees as we possibly can and help them be successful, we are not paying attention to the story of Jesus. Because that's what following Jesus means. That our effort is to open our arms, not close our hearts.
And it's not even, we're not saying here that there shouldn't be a process. We understand processes are important.
Yeah.
And it should be, it has to be a good and fair and just process that every person is seen for who they are.
And whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that we don't have a process? Is it the refugees' fault?
No.
It's our fault.
Yes.
And so if we don't have a process, look, those refugees, when they're running for their lives, they're still going to try to protect their families. And you cannot fault them for that.
The question has to be the vetting process. Are we being fair? Are we being just? Are we being, there's just so many details into that, and so many gray areas and even dark areas that we need to reform and correct, because it's just a bad system and it's a broken system. But we have to understand that it reflects what we think. We have that system still there because we want it there.
Yeah.
We want it this way because we don't want to make it easy for people to come in and find refuge amongst us. And it's the whole story of Christ, of baby Jesus coming in looking for a place, and then as a refugee looking for where to find refuge. And we have to really understand the narrative of the primitive church and what they were about, because it's very, very, very opposite to what our American church thinks.
Yeah. And without question, and I know we're needing to say goodbye here, but This is one of the most beautiful stories we have, this birth story. And it is so packed with so many important thoughts and ideas and values, all of the things that have become really gospel, and how seldom the story is used to communicate God's openness and love and welcome and inclusion of all people without exception. And we get so hung up on the details that we forget to announce the good news at Christmas time.
Right.
And we get so close because the story has it all. Mm-hmm. So at least we tell the story. I'm glad we tell the story. Mm-hmm. I'm glad we read the story because maybe somebody out there will see something about what this means and believe it.
Well, on that note, we will close.
And we'll wish everybody a Merry Christmas.
And we want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas. And to take the story for what it is. Mm-hmm. You know, the story it's a raw story. It's a difficult story. Yeah. It's an oppressing story. It's an unjust story. And it should challenge us.
It's just not a religious story.
It's not even. We make it a religious
It's a human story.
It's a human story.
Yeah.
It is.
And it's
about suffering, and it's about displacement, and it's about
all the stuff.
Not being welcomed, being rejected, being disenfranchised, this is the Christ. This is the story. Instead of us, in our large trees and our Christmas decorations and our, little mangers and ornaments or wherever you want to put it, and all of our gifts underneath the tree. I'm not saying all of that is bad and we shouldn't do that. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I'm trying to say is that we have glamorized and so commercialized Christmas. We have disconnected ourselves, like you were talking about pageants and all of these things. We have totally separated ourselves in such a way, maybe not even purposely, but in such a way that we're missing the rawness of the story, the humanity of the story, which you're talking about, we're talking about right now. It was not a pretty story, but the church wanted you to know that because that's what they were living to. Mm-hmm. That's not what we're living. That's not what we're living, especially in this nation. But it's something that we need to begin to grasp because it's a way of deconstructing the way the modern church, the American church, has taught us, in focusing on the glamorized, and focusing on the materialism, in focusing on the supremacy of things too, and the privilege of it all. Yet we're finding Christ the complete opposite of what I just mentioned right now. So this is the Christmas story.
Yeah, it's a story through which we can embrace, who we are as human beings. Right. And not just who we are, but who everyone is,
right?
Who is human,
right?
And what everyone deserves. And it's the story that says that, Jesus had the most humble birth you could imagine.
Yeah.
And here was one born in a manger who was serenaded by angels, visited by shepherds, given gifts by the counselors of kings. And if you want to know something about your own birth, read about Jesus' birth.
Right.
Because that's who you are.
Right.
And everyone you meet, that's who you're talking to.
And you know what? The church has done a miserable job at welcoming people. Because of the conditions that we continually put. Christ came to show us there's none of that. He identifies completely with those that have been disenfranchised, rejected, forgotten, not welcomed.
And when the church does welcome people, when it does welcome people, especially people who are different than you are, and we're all different from each other, when it does do that, it reflects. When it opens its doors and doesn't put conditions,
that's right.
It reflects the very fabric of these stories and the narrative that generated and motivated the telling and the remembering and eventually the writing down of these
and
stories.
It's more than just welcoming, like, having a welcome team at the door and giving a little gift or a prize to those that are here, and
it's good
putting on a name tag.
There's
and
more.
Identify, and I'm not against that, but that's as far as we go in welcoming. How far will we go in welcoming literally the refugee, the disenfranchised? What are ways that we can stand in solidarity? What are ways that we can truly support? What are ways that we can bring dignity to those that feel that they have none because of how they've been treated? So that's the Christmas story. In a nutshell.
Yeah. And maybe when we get back, we can talk a little bit about, there's a lot that went on after Christmas. In fact, a lot of these stories we've been talking about today went on, through those 12 days of Christmas and on into Epiphany.
Yeah.
And maybe those are some things we could come back to maybe at the new year.
Sounds good. Well, it was good to have you all. We want to wish you all a Merry Christmas and happy holidays. And, happy holidays, most definitely. It's not just about Christmas. It's about, this is a holy season for many in different religions. And we totally want to honor and dignify and respect it. So happy holidays to everyone. And we'll be back in the new year, at least see if we can close it out with 1 or 2 more episodes and head into another season after that. And I think we're going to have some fun if we can plan out some things, if we can talk about what that's going to look like. Maybe when we come back for the last episode or 2 episodes, we can kind of maybe throw out some type of information on it or at least the planning of it. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, Bob, Merry Christmas, happy holidays,
Alex.
And to your family too, and to everyone that's watching. Thanks for being with us. And, thank God for 2024. It was a very difficult year.
Yeah.
In many, many ways, it was a very challenging year. One of the most challenging. We've had losses. We've had some wins. We've had some losses, maybe more losses than wins. And I don't just mean that on the political side and all of that, but some of us have lost loved ones, and it's been a very difficult year. Some of us have transitioned, and I kind of want to bring that up in the next episode because we need to talk about that a little bit too, because Bob has retired from
big announcement.
Yeah. So from being pastor at Sierra Vista Community Church, but what does the future hold for Bob? Maybe we got to talk about that in the next episode. So, all right. Take care, everyone. We love you all. Let us know you're watching, you're listening, that, hey, we want to be here with you and in this process of deconstruction. God bless.